Okay, great. I think we're live. Well, welcome everyone. I want to welcome you to Carnegie's virtual event, Watching the Watchers, Investigative Journalism in the Digital Age. Today, we're going to discuss how advanced technology is both allowing governments to exploit ever greater levels of control and repression at times, but is also empowering individuals to demand ever greater levels of accountability. While different leaders leverage new tools to influence public opinion, to potentially censor dissidents, investigative journalists and other citizen activists have found ways to use the same technologies to challenge these regimes. So our goal today is to highlight efforts occurring on the front lines of these events. My name is Steve Feldstein. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program, where I work on issues related to the intersection of digital technology and politics. We have three excellent panelists today who have been engaged in highly visible reporting that highlights alarming behavior from many powerful governments, from China's internment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang province and use of powerful advanced surveillance methods to maintain control over the population, to Belarus's exploitation of advanced US censorship tools to suppress dissent, and Greek officials' use of lethal force against refugees and migrants trying to break through border controls. These are just some of many of the stories that our panelists today have broken. Let me start by introducing each in turn, and then we'll go immediately into our discussion. So first, we have Megha Rajagopal. She's an international correspondent for BuzzFeed News based in London. She has reported from 23 countries in Asia and the Middle East on stories ranging from the North Korea nuclear crisis to the peace process in Afghanistan. She was the first journalist to find and visit an internment camp for Uyghur Muslims in China's far west, work for which she won the Human Rights Press Award in 2018. In 2019, she won a Mirror Award for an investigation uncovering the links between Facebook and religious violence in Sri Lanka. She's a recognized expert on the subject of mass surveillance in authoritarian contexts and has spoken about her work at a variety of institutions around the world. Next, we have Ryan Gallagher. Ryan is an investigative reporter on the Bloomberg News cybersecurity team, covering the intersection between technology, crime, national security, and civil liberties. Previously, he was an investigative reporter and editor at The Intercept and a contributing reporter for The Guardian and Slate magazine. He has produced investigative stories on governments and intelligence agencies in collaboration with international news organizations, including Der Spiegel, Channel 4 News, and Le Monde. Ryan has also appeared as a guest on television, radio, from BBC to Sky News to PBS and many others. Finally, we have Nick Waters. Nick is a senior investigator for Bellingcat and a former military officer with experience in cyber threat intelligence. His work has focused on the application of open source techniques to the investigation of conflict, ranging from chemical weapons in Syria to the use of lethal force on the borders of the EU. He is currently working on the systematic application of these techniques to track conflicts and improve international accountability. So with that, I think we have an excellent panel and really the basis for a great conversation for this hour. I would also encourage you, as you listen to and hear the conversation, to think of your own questions around the 40-minute mark. I will turn to different questions that you write in the chat box and really do our best to try to address those. So please think early right now about what you might want to ask our panelists, and we'll do our best to try to accommodate those questions. So I want to start by asking each of our panelists to tell a story about a piece of investigative reporting that exemplifies the challenge and opportunities of reporting, undertaking investigations in the digital age. So why don't we start with Megha? Your stories have covered a range of areas related to digital repression and the use of technology and other means to restrict political freedoms. You've been particularly recognized for your reporting related to abuses by the Chinese government in Xinjiang against the Uyghur population. And as I mentioned, you were one of the first reporters to break the story, but you've also paid a price. Your visa was not renewed by the Chinese government, and you're no longer able to report from within the country. So let me turn it over to you first to talk about your reporting, exemplifying investigative reporting in the digital era. Over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me on this panel. So my history is actually mostly as a China reporter. I've reported in a lot of places, but I spent probably six years of my career in China, first with Reuters, and then later I joined BuzzFeed. I lost my China visa in 2018 as a result of some of the work that I did in Xinjiang, sort of most likely as a result of some of that work. And it was really disappointing because, of course, you want physical access as a journalist. You want to be able to go and talk to people and see things, and to be able to document things in those kind of traditional ways. But then after I left, I kind of didn't really want to let go of the story. It's of course a massive human rights and humanitarian crisis. And it, on top of that, it sort of reflects the way that surveillance technology is used against racial and ethnic minorities in a way that I think is important for the rest of the world to understand, and in a way that could very well be replicated by other states in the future. So I wanted to continue to follow this story. About a year after I left China, I started thinking about this idea that we knew that these internment camps were there. We knew that a lot of people were being detained into these camps. By then, it was already known that hundreds of thousands of people had disappeared into these kind of secretive facilities, and maybe even more than 1 million. Yet nobody really knew where the overwhelming majority of the camps were. Nobody knew how many there were, or what kind of buildings there were, or really that much detail. The camps that were known about were discovered because somebody had been to one of them and then managed to escape and then leave China, or because some journalists like me had gone and visited, by car or on foot or something, or, for other incidental reasons. Like there were some researchers who were looking at things like procurement records and other kind of documentation to find these camp locations. But essentially, it was kind of a non-systematic, really sporadic type of process. And around the summer of, I think it was probably 2018, I met a woman named Alison Killing, who is an architect and a human rights researcher as well, investigator. And we started talking about this issue. She had worked a lot in the European migration crisis using satellite imagery. And we sort of started to wonder if we could use satellite imagery to uncover the locations of more of these camps. And then we ended up linking up with a programmer named Christo Buszczek, and the three of us embarked on this project to try to, we wanted to find where are all of the camps. Like that was the goal. And what we came up with all of these kind of hypotheses about what we could do. We wanted to do like a machine learning process that like never worked or went anywhere. But eventually what happened was, Allison kind of by chance realized that if you looked at the maps like component of Baidu, which is the Chinese search engine that is sort of the equivalent of Google in China, if you looked at their maps in lots of places in Xinjiang, what you would find is that there would be like maps, satellite maps are made up of like these squares, right? So like if you went on Google Earth or Google Maps, you would see these like this grid of spaces that are made up of squares. And what we found on Baidu Maps was that some of these squares were just blanked out. And at first we were like, maybe they just don't have an image, maybe it's not loading for whatever reason. But we realized like when there wasn't a good image for whatever reason, they're just, it was foggy that day or something like that, then it presented a different kind of tile. So we sort of thought that, maybe this is kind of a form of government censorship. And we came up with this idea of what if we could find all of these blanked out tiles. There are, of course, millions of map tiles in the region of Xinjiang because it's a big region. So it wouldn't have been possible for us to comb through millions of tiles. It just would have been too much. But we thought, well, if we could find the blanked out tiles on Baidu, and then we compare it to an outside, like a satellite imagery provider that is outside of China and therefore not subject to Chinese government censorship, if we found those same locations in Google Earth or Planet Images or something like that, then perhaps this was a way for us to find more of the camps. And believe it or not, it actually worked. It wasn't quite as simple as that, but we had to go through a lot of other places that were censored for different reasons, not because they were internment camps, but because they were military installations or other kind of sensitive facilities. Some of the places we found weren't camps. So we had, a different rubric of other criteria that we used to determine whether places were camps. And we did a lot of interviewing and stuff like that. But I think at the core of that project was sort of, it was not only was it kind of a technological solution to a kind of reporting problem that could not have been addressed through traditional reporting means, but it was also, like, weirdly enough, it was the situation where we used the Chinese government's very heavy-handed censorship and its kind of drive to cover up what it was doing, like, as a way to actually figure out more about what was happening in that region. And there's something kind of very satisfying about that. But it also, yeah, I mean, it sort of led me in a direction where I was thinking about, the kind of double-sided nature of both of technology and also the suppression of technology that happens in China.
That's great. What a fascinating just sort of insight into how you approach this issue. And, it's something I want to discuss a little later on with everyone, is kind of what is this balance between new digital techniques that are being used to do exactly what you mentioned in terms of uncovering areas and issues that were formerly inaccessible, while at the same time using more old-fashioned sourcing and other techniques to verify and bring the information to light. It also reminds me a little bit of some of the work that I previously did with groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, who have incorporated satellite imagery as a means to verify human rights allegations. I remember in particular, there was a report that came out 4 or 5 years ago in relation to counter Boko Haram efforts in Nigeria. And they were trying to verify whether the Nigerian army had undertaken scorched earth tactics against villagers as a means to clear up Boko Haram. And so they ended up showing satellite imagery of specific villages that were far out, in very, in the northeast of Nigeria, in forests that were inaccessible to outsiders. And through that imagery, they were able to make pretty strong inroads in terms of verifying that actually some kind of major catastrophe had occurred with these villages, most likely linked to those army units. So I do think that this, to me, represents another front, another wave in terms of incorporating technology for this type of investigations. Let me next turn to Ryan. So Ryan, in recent months, you've broken a number of hard-hitting stories related to the use of U.S. technology in particular by authoritarian governments to repress their citizens. I'm thinking specifically about the example of Belarus, whose president, Lukashenko, is fighting hard to stay in power despite a rigged election and mass protests to get him out of power. So perhaps you'd like to comment on the process of investigating the story, or perhaps touch upon other reporting you've done in terms of investigating spyware or use of repressive technology for governments to counteract civilian protests. Let me turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll talk specifically about the Belarus and the case with the US company Sandvine, first of all, just because it's kind of the most timely and it's still ongoing. So what happened was, of course, a couple of months ago when the presidential election was taking place in Belarus, there were massive protests after the results were announced, as everyone's probably seen in the news. Those protests have continued. But during the protests, and actually before the protests, there was a internet shutdown. Large parts of the internet in Belarus were just completely inaccessible. Like 95% of the normal functioning internet was closed down. People couldn't get onto social media. They couldn't get onto normal messaging apps. They couldn't access news websites, and they therefore were unable to really communicate with each other as they were trying to coordinate protests and discuss what was going on with the election. And after observing that had happened, I was interested to try and just learn a little bit more about the technological side of how have they done that, what exactly has gone on in Belarus. I didn't really know at that point anything about any of the companies that were involved in helping the country to do any of that. I was just sort of digging around and seeing what I could find out. And I started, speaking to a lot of people who were in Belarus. Obviously, the reporting is complicated because not only because Belarus in itself is a problematic country to go into as a reporter. And usually I might have tried to get in there physically to do the reporting, to meet people. But obviously with the COVID pandemic, I've been working from home most of the time. So relying a lot on just trying to build networks of sources through, and in the Belarus case, it was often Telegram we were using because Belarusians are very active on the Telegram network. There's a lot of different groups that they use on there. And I found some people on that who gave me some ideas about some of the technology that was being used. The tips that I initially got through social media, through like Telegram, then led me to procurement records that showed the government had purchased a kind of technology called deep packet inspection, deep packet inspection systems. These are used to monitor and filter internet traffic nationwide in most countries. These tools can be used to, for example, block out child abuse images, which they are in the UK where I am based. They can be used to filter out or to block access to terrorist websites, for example, like ISIS propaganda. But what was happening in Belarus was they'd obtained these systems, and we discovered that they were using them to block access to hundreds of different like opposition political websites, international news websites, social media like Twitter, Facebook, even messaging apps like WhatsApp, and in some cases they were able to block Telegram, other apps. So that from the procurement records, I discovered that, and then just digging around, doing sort of very typical reporting methods, just trying to find sources and speaking to different people in Belarus and people actually in Russia and other countries who were familiar with the Belarusian government. And in the end, I was luckily able to find some people who were effectively became whistleblowers for us, and who revealed that a particular company, Sandvine, a US-owned company owned by the California-based private equity company Francisco Partners, had in fact sold the Belarusian government this deep packet inspection technology, which the government was using to censor the internet. And we were able to report that. Thanks to we were able to get some documents to prove it, and we were able to rely on those to report the story. And initially, Sandvine didn't comment at all, just refused to engage on it. But after there was quite a big backlash, for example, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Marco Rubio, human rights groups got involved. Access Now, the human rights group, was condemning it. And there were also actually about half a dozen protests in the US and Canada outside of Sandvine and Francisco Partners offices. The company then came out and made a statement that they were going to stop working with Belarus. And up until that point, inside of the company, we learned that they had actually been defending the sale. They had said that they didn't believe blocking access to websites was even a human rights violation. That's what they told employees internally, but they reversed course on that position. And so I think part of the reason why they said they were going to stop dealing with the company was dealing with Belarus was the backlash, but also we spoke to a number of experts on sanctions and export controls who said that the deal they did with Belarus may have actually violated US sanctions. And that's still an open issue. It's not clear whether that the US Treasury is looking at that. They've not engaged with us on it. But just to conclude, we then started digging into Sandvine's other sales around the world, and we found out that the Belarus case wasn't a one-off, and actually they had done deals with some of the most repressive governments anywhere in the world, like for example Eritrea, which is considered by many human rights groups to be even more repressive than North Korea. They also sold their technology to Azerbaijan, Egypt, Sudan, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, Uzbekistan, Qatar, and a number of other countries, Jordan. where the technology was being used to block access to LGBTQ websites. In Egypt, it's being used to block access to like 100 different independent news sources. So this is a massive issue, global issue, and this American owned company is selling this stuff worldwide, and we were able to report that largely, I would say, due to whistleblowers who came forward. But initially, as I said, I had no idea that this was going on, and it snowballed from just an initial couple of tips that we got and became something much larger than I ever envisioned it would be.
That's great. No, thank you so much for shedding more light into that recent reporting, which, I think often you hear allegations and good reporting, and you sometimes wonder, what can be the impact. And at least in the kind of narrow circumstance of this U.S. company having to back away from the provision of its technology to Belarus, I think your reporting, I could say from my vantage point, was instrumental in actually changing around and putting policy pressure on Sandvine to readjust its behavior in this instance. And that's, I think that's a real example of impact. I think you also make a good point too, and one that I've tried to make more broadly on the kind of topic of digital authoritarianism, that I think there's been a very large preoccupation with looking at China, rightly so, given so many of the authoritarian practices it's using when it comes to applying technology to accomplish its political repressive aims. At the same time, I think many Western companies, as well as Western governments, don't have clean hands either. And whether it's less of a directed program and more of an enablement, there's still a lot of damage and harm that's occurring for human rights around the world in precisely the kind of countries you mentioned, in Gulf states, countries in Southeast Asia, and others with long repressive records. So I think that's something that hopefully all of your reporting will continue to kind of look into. That my personal viewpoint is that it's China, but it's many other countries as well that are engaged in this sort of space. Let me turn next to Nick. Nick, you're part of a groundbreaking outfit, Bellingcat, which is an independent international collective of researchers, investigators, and citizen journalists using open source and social media investigations to probe a variety of subjects, from Mexican drug lords and crimes against humanity to tracking the use of chemical weapons. And really, I think many consider Bellingcat to be groundbreaking in terms of how you've pioneered and really been able to capture the investigative resources of individuals who maybe on their own aren't able to fully uncover actions that are taking place, but together within a network are able to use their collective resources to better uncover actions undertaken by various authoritarian regimes worldwide, as well as some democratic ones. You've personally led several different investigations, including a report, as I mentioned, that exposes Greek officials' use of lethal force against refugees and migrants trying to get through border controls. Let me turn it over to you to talk either about that or a story that you would like to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me on here. So before I actually go into describing that investigation in detail, I just want to talk about how people react in certain situations, stressful situations that are out of the ordinary. A lot of times people, run or hide, will take pretty rational decisions. But even in life-threatening situations, some people will pull out their phones and start taking pictures and videos of what's happening in the world around them. And although there's an element of voyeurism to this, there's a really strong element of bearing witness. People want to record what is happening. People want to show the world, hey, actually, this is happening. Here's the evidence. And so what we've tried to do in a lot of our investigations is gather that information, use it to work out what has actually happened in these incidents, a lot of which are incredibly contentious. So with regards to the investigation on the border, around late February, early March this year, there was a confrontation between Turkey on one hand and the European Union on the other. And lots of refugees and migrants were caught up in the middle as Turkey busted into the border with Greece and said, Greece is going to open its border gates. That was not true. And so you therefore had thousands of refugees and migrants on the borders at Evros, or around the town of Evros, who couldn't get through, and understandably, they were a little bit angry about that. We then saw like a few period of days of protests and violence on that border, but it really came to a head on the 4th of March, when we saw something like 6 or 7 people being carried out of the fields that ran along that border on the Turkish side with what looked like pretty grievous wounds. And so what we did is we looked at multiple different platforms, combed through keywords to identify all the images and the videos of this really key period of about an hour between 9:30, 10 till 11 o'clock that morning, when these people had been shot and one, Mohammed Golzar, had been killed. And what we managed to do is reconstruct this hour actually with quite a surprising level of detail, because we had over 100 videos which showed this period of time, totaling something like 7 hours of footage. So we actually had quite a good situational awareness of what had taken place. And we put this into a model built by forensic architecture to see, who was where and when. And by doing so, we could see where all the casualties were injured, where they were carried back, and when, pretty much down to the minute. So, actually a really high level of detail from me sitting, me and a couple of other people, like sitting there on computers, looking at these videos and piecing them all together. And one really key video caught the shooting of one of the refugees on the border. This was a young man. He was standing just on the Turkish side of the border, and there's a group of guys trying to get through the fence. They set the fence on fire to try and break through. And then we have a video of a person filming this incident. You can hear him describing that the Greek police and soldiers are there. And then you hear a fusillade of shots. And the person, or the cameraman, says, "The Greeks are shooting at us. Oh, look, I've seen someone who is shot." And what we did is we looked at that video, that incident, analyzed it, placed it in time and space. We gathered other videos showing the same incident, but from different viewpoints, both from Turkish and the Greek side. And we identified by audio forensic analysis that live rounds had certainly been fired within that incident, and fired by a rifle that was consistent with an M16. Now, because we had these videos, we could see on the Turkish side, there didn't appear to be anyone within something like 800 or 900 meters who was armed at all. Whereas on the Greek side, you had 50 meters away, you had a line of Greek soldiers armed with M16s. And also we had footage from the Greek side from journalists saying, "Oh, look, he aimed," and then someone else in the background saying it's the only way to make them learn. So by putting all this information together, disparate images or videos, glimpses of the situation, we can build it into actually a cohesive picture to work out what has happened. And yeah, I think it was quite an impactful investigation, ended up with questions being asked in the European Parliament, and the Greek government calling us fake news, which is always fun. But within that partnership, we've built on it, and just a few days ago, we released an investigation into Frontex, the European Border Force, using slightly different but similar techniques, showing that they've been participating in legal pushbacks as well along this border. And so it's quite interesting using this remote sensing as well as journalists on the ground, combine that information together to see what is happening. Thank you.
That's great. No, I mean, first of all, I'm really struck, really by all of you in terms of your techniques, but what you described, Nick, really is kind of a really thorough way to use incorporate digital forensics in terms of your work, and kind of piecing together hours of the video from different vantage points, as you mentioned, is something that I've started to pick up in different investigations that seems to have a really powerful effect. I remember there was a BBC Live Eye that was sort of a stitched together viewpoint of a massacre of demonstrators. I think it was last year, that kind of cobbled together from hundreds of different smartphones, video footage, second by second, that showed a massacre taking place that was broadcast to the world. So even though the internet was shut down, so people weren't able to view this in real time, by cobbling together all this information ex post and then publishing this, I think it put a lot of international pressure on the Sudanese government, and we actually see where there's been some real political change in that context. So it's really, I think, really fascinating, important work that you all are doing. So let me broaden the conversation a little bit. I think a kind of, and this is really for all of you, but describing. I would like to hear you describe a little more the challenges you have faced in reporting on some of the most repressive and technologically sophisticated regimes in the world. To what extent have you, first of all, felt some personal risk in terms of actually pushing on very sensitive topics, against governments that have an array of resources to push back? And I'm not just talking about, sort of countering with fake news. I'm saying, much more sophisticated ways to push back. To what extent have you felt threatened, and why do you think you're still able to get these stories out despite the immense risk to yourselves? Really, any of you who wants to start? Why don't I turn to Mega first, and then we'll kind of go through.
It's a good question. It's a tough one. I think if you had asked even 6 months or a year ago, I probably would have said that the risk to myself, particularly in the China context, is really minimal, I think, just because China is not a government that goes around jailing journalists, foreign journalists all the time. Their own journalists, yes, they do. But it's these things change very quickly. And I think China's a really good example of that. They essentially in their system, that it's sort of, there's a deliberate ambiguity about what is permissible and what isn't. It's very different from a place like Thailand, where I've also reported, where there's a very clear line, you don't criticize the monarchy, and they will come after you if you criticize the monarchy. But in many other contexts, it's acceptable to criticize the government. There's some ambiguity there as well, but in China, you don't get these very, very firmly drawn lines. And that's why we've seen, for instance, in the past couple of years, the arrest of the two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, on what is clearly trumped up national security charges. This is why we've seen so many American journalists and journalists of other nationalities expelled this year as part of this kind of great power game between China and the US. In practical terms, in terms of consequences that I've faced, you mentioned that I lost my visa. That's probably the biggest thing that's happened to me, because I was based in the country for just a real long time, and it wasn't expected. But I'm still publishing on China. I live in London, so there's kind of I don't really think about risk every day in the way that I maybe used to. But after we published our latest story, they published several articles in state media essentially calling us liars. There was a mid-level Chinese diplomat who went on Twitter and actually doxed me. He published my full passport number, my birth date. It was part of this old visa that they had a copy of because it was a China visa. And I think the biggest thing that I would emphasize is to do this kind of work, I think probably all of us work with sources that are in much more vulnerable positions than us. If you're working in a different language, in my case, I did a lot of the reporting in Kazakh, which I'm not a Kazakh speaker. I don't speak Russian. What I could do in Chinese and English, I did, but I did work with translators and stuff like that in Uyghur and Kazakh. Those people are in far more vulnerable positions. I probably won't get into detail, but I will say that there has definitely been blowback on contacts of mine and people that I've worked with in the past. And that is something that I take really seriously. And we, of course, work very hard to mitigate that from the outset. And then when things happen, we do work to try to help people. But it's sort of a reminder that these things, like pressure from very powerful governments, don't stop at their borders. And it's something that you have to be conscious of, as I think it's a core part of doing this type of work. It has to factor into our ethical considerations, I think, from the beginning to the end, and then well past publication.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what's interesting is that I agree in terms of China. I think that generally, the trend has been that foreign reporters in particular have been less of a target when it comes to, the Chinese state. But you know, there seems to be kind of a new level of aggressiveness. I saw, for example, exactly what you mentioned. I think you tweeted out what they had done in terms of doxing you recently in terms of your records. And you know, I think there's more and more instances where people are looking at Chinese trolling of dissidents outside and so forth, which makes for you know, a very kind of more tenuous environment. Ryan, any thoughts on the topic? Oh, Ryan, I can't hear anything from you.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
I muted my microphone. I'm sorry. I was just saying on the stories on Belarus that I was doing. I felt relatively safe here completely. I'm in the UK. Had I been in Belarus, I might have been in some trouble. But like Mega, I really worry more for my sources. In my reporting, I often speaking to people who are taking big risks to talk to me. Certainly in this Belarus story, where we had people who were providing us information from inside of the country, and at a time when the government was really trying to crack down on anyone speaking against it. So no, I felt pretty safe. I have had, you know, you get abuse and you get threatening emails and things, but it's never anything that I've really you know, been too concerned about. Actually, probably the scariest time in my reporting career was like 5 years ago, before I was at Bloomberg, when I was working on the Snowden documents, and the British government was trying to suppress that reporting, and actually went in and smashed up the Guardian's hard drives, and was opened a criminal investigation into reporters who were working on the stories, and was threatening to arrest people. And you know, so I've actually, somewhat ironically, given this conversation we're having, the biggest threat I've probably faced has been from my own government here in the UK. But you know, when it comes to the authoritarian regimes, because I'm not based there, I feel a lot safer. And you know, there's probably a few countries now I can't visit, but that's okay. I don't mind that. I think I'm okay here. The main concern I have is just the sources, and we try and take as many precautions as we can to keep them safe.
Right. No, I think you know, what you mentioned is absolutely true. We have so many instances of local sources, local journalists, and others who have faced immense persecutions, imprisonments, killings by governments. So it's certainly, and it seems to me that trend has increased even further. But when it comes to international reporters, I guess, you know, at least in your experience, it's good to hear that you know, the most threats you've received has been from a liberal Democratic government, although not so good to hear, just that I guess ironic in that sense. Let me turn to Nick. You know, I'm particularly interested, given how much Bellingcat has been a thorn in the side of the Russian government on some very nasty issues involving you know, activities undertaken abroad in places like the UK, such as poisonings. I'm curious what your thoughts are, either for you or your colleagues, when it comes to personal safety.
I mean, I pretty much echo Mega and Ryan. You know, our primary, like, I'm based in the UK. I haven't felt any kind of physical threat here. And clearly there's like an information threat. We've been the target of several phishing and spearphishing campaigns by primarily Fancy Bear, which is the GRU, the Russian intelligence service. And we may be the target of other attacks that I don't think we can work out exactly who they came from. But again, that's all kind of more information-based. And the information that is primarily of interest to us is, you know, sources and potentially people who have spoken to us. However, there are also people like within Bellingcat who, you know, are Russian, or who are very closely partnered with Bellingcat who are Russian. We've got employees who are in Kyrgyzstan and Armenia, both of whom have released some pretty punchy reports, and indeed have faced much higher personal risks than I ever have. So for me, the physical threat, no, not really at all. It's primarily an information threat, but primarily my concerns in terms of that lie with our sources and our employees who are in some of these repressive countries.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. You know, one of the issues I track when it comes to kind of levels of digital repression is the kind of comparative arrest record of online users, whether it's local journalists, citizen activists, civil society organizations. But I've measured that within country, and you do see a very strong correlation to, you know, those countries that are lowest in terms of levels of political freedoms also are increasingly targeting online users, producers of information, because they know this is a way to stifle the information flow and maintain control. But it's interesting that there hasn't been as much of an outward shift towards reporters, at least in terms of your experiences. Hopefully that's something that will continue to be a protected space. You know, I want to ask a question. Oh, actually, before I do that, let me just encourage those in the audience that if you do have questions, I'm happy to take your queries, but otherwise I will continue with some of the questions that I have on hand for our panelists. So I wanted to ask a question about media gatekeepers because this is an issue that's been in the news quite a bit in the, you know, the real, especially within the context of the United States and elections. But, you know, there was a sense, I think, in 2016 that media as gatekeepers of information had become a very diminished role, and that if information was out there, it was going to be seen anyway, so you might as well report on it. And so that, you know, happened in terms of the relation of the email dump with Hillary Clinton, other types of information along those lines. I think there's been, in some respects, in 2020, kind of a movement the other way, where there's been more of a desire by media gatekeepers to play that gatekeeping role and to not report on all information, particularly information that may come from questionable sources that may relate to disinformation. And so now there's some questions about whether that's happening too much in the other direction. But I'm interested to hear your perceptions about media gatekeeping and how that affects your work, particularly because each one of you comes from a slightly different type of outfit. You know, one with Ryan and Bloomberg, I'd say, fits within the traditional media gatekeeping role. Mega, you're sort of in a newer outfit, one that's gained increasing credibility with the big players, but still is viewed as a newcomer. And then Nick, of course, with Bellingcat, you know, you're really, you know, very new to the game in terms of how one thinks of the gatekeeping paradigm. So I'd be interested to hear your perceptions about that, particularly as it relates to your own investigative reportings and how to get out information and how that's received. We can start with any one of you, or we could go back and go back to Mega and kind of work our way through.
Yeah, I can pick this up. There's a lot to say about this, so I'll try to keep it concise. But I think when I think about gatekeeping, the more interesting development this year to me has not been the revival of the traditional gatekeepers, which are, of course, like media, like primarily legacy media, but also outfits like BuzzFeed that have become very mainstream more recently. But actually what I think is more interesting is the advent of social media giants now taking on a new gatekeeping role, which they were openly and explicitly opposed to for the majority of their time in existence, like in our public life. You know, and like the most like obvious example of this is Zuckerberg's kind of about face in how he's handling political speech and disinformation. And this comes after, you know, years of reporting by a lot of people, including Ryan's excellent work, that has sort of uncovered the kind of disproportionate impacts that Facebook can have on political speech, especially in places like really far from the U.S. and places where liberal democratic norms are not in place. So this is interesting because, like, to me, like there's two sides to this. So like on the one hand, these platforms have a really huge impact on the information that people consume. They are the conduit through which people process information that is put out there by the traditional gatekeepers, by legacy media. But sort of on the other hand, they have depended for a long time on the kind of legal protections, particularly in the US, that comes from being seen as just like the conduit for information information and not as a kind of publisher of information in and of themselves. So I guess like the analogy for this would be like they're like the radio station rather than the radio program. That's sort of historically how they've wanted to be perceived. But we're sort of now in this position where the leaders of these platforms, which are all, of course, you know, publicly traded but private companies that are based in Silicon Valley, we have a situation where the people that run these companies and the content moderators that they hire and the policy people that they hire are in charge of regulating speech in a way. And they're regulating it in a way that is like sort of right now is like not like is kind of like very, very minor, like relative to the amount of speech and the kind of diversity of speech that happens on this platform. But I think this year we've seen them set a precedent for determining, for instance, what is disinformation, what is dangerous disinformation, what is hate speech, what is speech that is inciting violence. You know, like, of course, we've seen the kind of destruction that speech like this can cause. The very obvious example is Myanmar, in which the UN explicitly said that Facebook had exacerbated the genocide there because of its lack of attention to hate speech and speech inciting violence. I've reported on that subject myself, and it is definitely true that during that time period, there was a lot of really, really vile and violent speech against not just Rohingya Muslims who were the target of the genocide, but all Muslim minorities who live in Myanmar. But I think as societies, we need to now reckon with the fact that we have this kind of like, we have a new kind of subset of gatekeepers. And we actually know very little about the processes that go into these decisions about what speech is permissible and what's not. We know very little about the kind of people that they're hiring, how these policies may differ country to country, how politics and individual people's politics may influence these processes. I just think it's a bit of a new world, and I don't think that we've sort of fully considered the kind of long-term implications of that change.
I absolutely agree. In fact, I think there's a few top tech executives testifying this morning on this very issue in terms of implications for, at least in the United States, what we call Section 230, in terms of providing liability protection for platforms, in terms of what kind of speech is occurring, and now pushback politically, basically saying platforms, you need to regulate your content and cut down on hate speech and divisive content, but it puts all the onus and burden in a very opaque way on platforms to make those decisions. And I think many people are uncomfortable with this sort of newfound or increasing shift in that direction without clear rules of the road. So absolutely, you've opened up a gigantic issue that I think many of us are arguing very vigorously about what's the right way forward. Let me turn over to Ryan and Nick.
So I've been kind of part of this and seen how people's interaction with information have changed over the years. It's been kind of weird coming from someone who used to do this in the evening. I'd come home from my work at like cybersecurity at a bank, and then I'd work for like 3 or 4 hours on a report that would then get published the next day. It's kind of strange. But I do agree that the advent of social media, of mobile phones, of the ability to spread information much, much faster than any other period in human history. Twitter is possibly the most effective way for disseminating information that's ever been invented. Has completely revolutionized how individuals and institutions deal with information. And there are certainly new gatekeepers, as Mega said, social media giants with Twitter, with Facebook, what Facebook decides to go on its newsfeed is an incredibly important decision, which I don't think maybe in the last couple of years they started realizing it, but certainly didn't when they set it up. But the way we have interacted with information has gone through such a profound revolution. I mean, I spent 4 years as a regular army officer, and I've certainly seen more information, images, videos that would be rated as secret on my Twitter feed than I ever did when I was in the military. We're having to build new ways to understand what information to interact with, what information to share, what information to dismiss. So it's not just about new gatekeepers, it's about building a new epistemology. Who do we trust? How do we work out what do we actually know? And within those epistemologies is this new examination, I believe, a new examination of how to interact with that kind of information flow. And a really good example of that would be, I think, the New Zealand moth shooter, or the kind of manifestos that are being left by a lot of mass shooters. In a lot of the manifestos seen over the last couple of years, they're traps. They contain references to obscure memes. And, I think maybe 10 years ago, not even 10 years ago, like a couple of years ago, people look at those manifestos and print sections of them and try to analyze what the person means. And the reality is they're shitposting to try and get people to search those terms to be led down this path, down radicalization. And I think people are starting to understand that interacting with or applying how we used to interact with information now doesn't work so well. And so, as I said, people are trying to build these new epistemologies, trying to work out how to interact with information, especially in a world in which, yes, there are also absolutely new gatekeepers in the form of these social media giants as well.
Yeah, no, I think really, really great points. Ryan, let me put a finer point on the question I asked, in that there's been a recent Berkman Klein Center report, which I've been grappling with a lot, that actually kind of pushes back on the idea that when it comes to disinformation and the kind of going viral of certain news stories, that it's actually because of algorithms per se and social media distribution, that in fact, a good reason for how different news stories, bad news stories, stories that are sort of disinformation or are questionable, how they're propagated, and this relates a lot to kind of some of the stuff that's come from Trump, is actually due to gatekeepers. That because there has been in the recent past a kind of decision by large outlets to publish information, whether it's good information or bad information, as long as it comes from an important person's mouth. Therefore, certain lies, certain misinformation had spread in a viral way that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And so this has put the spotlight a bit more on gatekeepers in terms of what should or shouldn't come out and how much veracity ought to be attributed to this information. So I'm curious to hear, because you come from an outlet like Bloomberg, to what extent are those conversations something that you think about, or your colleagues?
Well, I mean, what I would say in the election context, obviously being in the cybersecurity team and dealing a lot with, we do a lot of stuff on disinformation and hacking. It's really our bread and butter. And we have thought a lot about, and I personally have thought a lot about, what happened in 2016 with the hacked emails, and how the media was effectively quite well manipulated to spread those emails. And I do think that there's certainly a lot more caution now. I think there's a lot more there's more willingness to just to be a bit more thorough, and to ensure that what you're dealing with is correct and you can verify it. I think that didn't happen with some media outlets in 2016. I think people were quite quick, jump the gun and just try and get a story out without thinking through what they were doing and who was giving them the information. But just from a personal reporting standpoint, I think we just have to be very careful about who we're dealing with, trying to understand better the motivations of people who are bringing information to you. In 2016, a lot of these emails came from people who were anonymous and who refused to give any information about who they were or who they were working with or why they were providing the information. And I do think that now, in this current election cycle, a lot of newsrooms are going to be so much more wary of doing that. They're not going to touch that stuff. And if they do touch it and publish it, they will do it probably only after having thoroughly vetted it and independently corroborated and verified it and done all that, which I don't know happened more recently with the New York Post stuff. I'm not sure how thoroughly they vetted that. But yeah, I mean, just more generally, I think people are more cautious. I think people have a better understanding in newsrooms of how they can be targeted and manipulated as part of disinformation operations and sort of unwittingly become part of those. And we do think about that a lot more now, I would say, after what's happened in the last few years.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to put it. We're nearing the end of our time. I want to ask one kind of final larger question for all you to ponder and respond to, which is that, we've talked a little bit about both sides of how digital technology is being used. We've talked about new ways that governments are manipulating information for repressive ends, whether it's omni surveillance purposes in Xinjiang, whether it's Belarus using US technology to cut down on the ability to censor protests, other types of methods. And there are a lot of people, I think, these days who are fairly pessimistic about what was formerly thought of as kind of liberalizing effect of technology. On the other hand, looking at the three of you right now, it strikes me that a large part of your work wouldn't be possible if not for the liberating effects of technology, whether it's the satellite feeds, that you mentioned, Mega, in terms of uncovering the internment camps, whether it's Telegram being a source of information, Ryan, in terms of Sandvine's activities in Belarus, or whether it's the stitching together of hundreds of disparate social, smartphone images and videos, Nick. When it comes to the border, we are, it seems to me, able to uncover bad acts and abuses that otherwise in the past were much harder to actually ascertain and to know. So where do you all come out on this? What's your perception? Are we in a negative space when it comes to technology's effects and politics, somewhere in the middle? I know it's too big of a question to really kind of answer, in a thorough way, but what's your kind of quick take? Let's start with Megan. We'll go around.
Yeah, I really don't. I mean, I feel like the framing of this question, is difficult because everything, like technology is not like satellite imagery and Telegram. Like technology can be anything. Like technology is like the computer that I'm doing this on. The wheel was a form of technology. Like we're just really talking about tools, right? So like in the end, I think tools can be used positively and negatively. Obviously not all tools are neutral. Like a gun is a piece of technology too. And I don't think a gun can necessarily be neutral. But I mean, I do think that there are some forms of new technology that have made it easier for people to bear witness, as Nick talked about, to put things out into the world. These are some of the same technologies that have made it easier for journalists to report on some of these same issues. But I think it would be sort of maybe too simplistic to say that it's like an overall positive or an overall negative, because it's come in tandem with other forces that have sort of suppressed the way that journalists can work and sort of the extent of the work that they can do.
Yep, no, fair enough. Ryan, and then Nick.
Yeah, well, what I would say is, and most of the reporting that I do at the moment is about how technology is being used in repressive ways, how Western companies in particular are profiting off of selling, technology to repressive governments. So, that's one side of it. Certainly, that there is a real big problem with how the internet, especially, and communications technology in the ways that it is advancing, is being used and exploited by governments to monitor citizens, to censor citizens. The internet can be used as a tool of control in a certain way, and it is being used as a tool of control in some countries, and that is the real conflict that we're seeing play out, is whether the internet can be a tool for liberating people or to repress people. And it's really both, and it's an active struggle that's going on. But for me personally, I think that, frankly, I don't think I could do my job if I didn't have the technology, if I didn't have the internet. Certainly now in the COVID era that we're living through, I just would not be able to function if I didn't have like Zoom, and it didn't have signal on my phone. I didn't have any of these amazing tools that we all now take for granted to just talk and share information with people. I really couldn't do the job. I couldn't do the work because I'm unable to meet people physically. So it's vital for me, but it's certainly, the bigger picture, what's happening is it's a double-edged sword, because there's a lot of bad things being done with technology, and governments are certainly using it in ways that are extremely repressive and problematic. And I think that for us as reporters, the best thing that we can do is to use our technologies and the technologies we use to shine light on the negatives, and to help expose that, and to perhaps bring accountability to some of the bad actors and the people who are using technology in negative ways to harm people.
Great, thank you. Over to Nick.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I actually wrote my master thesis on this. And I started off in 2016, I was, a few years ago now, but I started off with this idea of the internet as social media, as open source information, as incredible democratization of information, allowing people to see information or understand events in the world around them in a much better way. However, as I conducted my research for the theses, I went through and I just became incredibly depressed. Because although it does do all of those things, it allows people to look at the world around them and to understand what's happening in the world around them. Ultimately, it's not necessarily about the technology. It's about how people deal with information, and they do that in really interesting and funny ways. And ultimately, I came to the conclusion with my thesis that this spread of information was actually, and the technologies it was based on, was effectively inherently negative for human society. And that's not just based on, well, it's based on several factors. The primary one is that, this online world has effectively become the public space in which civil society interacts. And that actually has created a public space that is actually incredibly fragile. If you have a public space that is controlled by a state, as again, referring to as happened in China, but is being built, the infrastructure for which is being built in many other states around the world, that public space is squeezed, controlled, and can be destroyed in a few seconds if a government so wishes. And then you have the way that people interact with the kind of information that they consume within these public spaces. And if the information is bad, then their worldview changes. And if you don't, or if you create that echo chamber around you, if you put yourself in a space where your information flows are completely different from other people, you can effectively build a new reality around you. And so you're living in a different reality where, if you're, say, that group of people always do bad things and want to try and kill us, so therefore I am completely justified in doing horrible things to them and saying horrible things to them online that enable these actions to take place. I'm sorry to kind of finish that question on a negative note, but I do think, although there are many benefits that have come with this, I also think that a lot of it is inherently negative, and I don't think those can be separated from the positive benefits as well. My hope is this is ultimately simply a disruption, and that we will find ways to mitigate these kind of effects. But from what I'm seeing, that's going to take quite a long time, I think, to do, if ever. Yeah, no, thank you for your thoughts. And, I think it is a tough issue to deal with. The one thing I would just say in terms of my experience is I fully agree in terms of so much of the disinformation that's rife in the ecosystem, and so much of the echo chambers and kind of very narrow viewpoints that end up hurting the fragility of, civil society. But I also have seen in many authoritarian contexts the ability to use alternate communication channels, like the Hong Kong protests last year using Telegram, Belarus today, in Sudan, in Thailand, that's ongoing, where without this recourse, you simply wouldn't have the political mobilization possible to fight back against repressive governments. And so while I think the challenges are immense, as you've mentioned, and all of you have talked about,
I do think that there still is the kernel of a promise that can potentially be a force for good when it comes to human rights. We are out of time. I want to thank all three of you for dedicating an hour to talk about both your work and a difficult set of issues. I really think that you're all doing incredible investigations, and I encourage all of our audience to continue following closely what they unearth and uncover in the coming weeks and months. But thank you again for your time. Marissa will cut us out, so if you can just stay online for a second, we'll then end it. So thank you.